Approximately 37 million years ago, along the coastlines of what is now Antarctica, a world existed that shares almost nothing in common with the frozen continent recognizable today. The Southern Ocean was warmer, the landmass itself was only partially glaciated, and its beaches and shallow coastal shelves supported ecosystems of considerable complexity. Among the animals that moved through those ecosystems was a lineage of birds unlike any that exist in the modern world. Penguins that had evolved over millions of years of island isolation and abundant marine resources to a scale that contemporary biology would find difficult to accommodate. These were not marginally larger versions of living species. They were animals of a genuinely different order of magnitude, and the fossil record that documents them, though fragmentary, is unambiguous in what it describes. The most completely understood of these animals is Anthropornis nordenscueldi, known from fossils recovered primarily from Seymour Island, off the northern tip of the Antarctic Peninsula. Skeletal reconstructions place Anthropornis at a standing height of approximately 1.7 to 1.8 meters, roughly the height of an average adult human. Its body mass has been estimated at somewhere between 80 and 90 kilograms, though some analyses suggest individuals may have approached or slightly exceeded that range. For context, the largest living penguin species, the emperor penguin, stands at approximately 1.1 to 1.2 meters and reaches a maximum body mass of around 46 kilograms. Anthropornis was not simply taller, it was, by any reasonable measure, a fundamentally larger animal, with a proportionally heavier skeleton, longer flippers, and a bill designed for capturing prey considerably larger than what emperor penguins routinely pursue today. Before we go further, take a moment to consider where you're watching from, which country, and how distant it is from the hidden landscapes buried beneath Antarctica's ice, preserved for millions of years beneath one of the most isolated places on Earth. If these journeys into Earth's forgotten past keep drawing you in, consider subscribing to continue exploring them. It's always fascinating to see how far these stories travel. Lower the lights, settle into stillness, and let the modern world fade as endless ice stretches to the horizon, concealing ancient mountains, forests, rivers, and the silent echoes of a lost world far below the frozen surface. Anthropornis was not alone. The Eocene fossil record of Antarctica and the surrounding region has yielded evidence of a remarkable diversity of giant penguin species, many of them overlapping in both time and geography. Palaeodiptes klekowski, recovered from the same Seymour Island deposits, is currently the largest penguin species documented in the fossil record. Estimates based on limb bone scaling suggest it stood between 1.8 and 2 meters in height and may have weighed as much as 115 kilograms. This places it well beyond Anthropornis in body size and makes it, by any metric, the largest penguin that has ever been confirmed to exist. Its flippers, when extended, would have spanned a width sufficient to generate substantial thrust in deep water pursuit diving, a locomotory mode that penguins had already refined to a high degree of efficiency by this point in their evolutionary history. The question of why penguins reached these proportions during the Eocene is one that ecological and evolutionary biology can address with reasonable confidence. Body size in marine endotherms is shaped by a set of interacting pressures: thermoregulation efficiency, diving capacity, prey access, and competitive dynamics. Larger bodies retain heat more effectively in cold water, a principle described by Bergmann's rule, which has been documented repeatedly across marine mammal lineages and is considered applicable to penguins as well. A larger body volume relative to surface area reduces thermal loss per unit mass, meaning that a 90-kilogram penguin can sustain extended dives in cool water with considerably less energetic cost per dive than a 5-kilogram bird. This thermal advantage alone would have provided meaningful selective pressure toward increased size in a marine environment where water temperatures, while warmer than today, were already low enough to impose thermoregulatory demands. Diving capacity scales with body size in a well-documented relationship. Larger animals carry greater oxygen stores in both blood and muscle tissue, and their lower mass-specific metabolic rates mean that oxygen is consumed more slowly relative to the total reserve available. Among living penguins, emperor penguins are capable of dives exceeding 500 meters in depth and lasting more than 20 minutes, capacities directly tied to their relatively large body size. Extrapolating from these relationships, Anthropornis and Palaeodiptes would have been capable of accessing prey at depths and durations that smaller contemporaries could not reach. This would have given them access to a vertical zone of the water column that was effectively exclusive, a resource partition that reduced direct competition with smaller penguin species and with other seabirds. The fish fauna of the Eocene Southern Ocean was diverse and, in some lineages, large-bodied. Evidence suggests that the coastal and offshore waters surrounding Antarctica during this period supported abundant populations of teleost fishes, cephalopods, and crustaceans, all at sizes consistent with the jaw morphology and estimated gape dimensions of giant penguins. The bill of Anthropornis was elongated and robust, more lance-like than the shorter, hooked bills of modern species, a configuration well-suited to seizing fast-moving, slippery prey underwater. This is consistent with pursuit diving predation on midwater fish rather than shallow benthic foraging, and it implies a hunting ecology closer to that of large modern seabirds like gannets or tropic birds, though executed entirely in a subaqueous context. The beaches and nearshore environments of Eocene Antarctica would have presented a visual landscape almost entirely without modern analogue. Reconstruction of these coastlines, based on sedimentary evidence from Seymour Island and the James Ross Basin, indicates low-relief shorelines with exposed sandy and gravelly substrate, backed by vegetation in various stages of growth and seasonal change. The climate at this latitude during the early to middle Eocene was substantially warmer than today. Mean annual temperatures in Antarctic coastal regions are estimated to have been between 10 and 15 degrees Celsius, with sea surface temperatures in the surrounding ocean reaching 12 degrees or above. This was an environment warm enough to support diverse terrestrial vegetation and a persistent, productive marine ecosystem simultaneously. On these beaches, multiple penguin species coexisted, likely partitioning resources by body size, dive depth, and prey type in the manner that modern seabird communities do across oceanic islands. The presence of several giant species in the same geological formations does not necessarily indicate direct competition. Ecological theory and modern analogy both suggest that size differentiation of the magnitude observed between, for instance, Anthropornis and smaller contemporaries like Archaeospheniscus would have been sufficient to reduce dietary overlap to manageable levels. What the fossil assemblages from Seymour Island do indicate is that the giant penguin fauna was not a single dominant species surrounded by ecological subordinates, but rather a genuine community of large-bodied birds occupying a coastline that could evidently support their collective energetic requirements. It is worth noting that the penguins alive during the Eocene were not newly evolved. The penguin lineage had diverged from its flying ancestors in the vicinity of 60 to 65 million years ago in the late Cretaceous or earliest Paleocene, and by the time Anthropornis and Paleodyptes appeared in the fossil record, penguins had already been flightless, pursuit-diving marine predators for well over 20 million years. The transition to giant body size was therefore not a sudden emergence, but rather the product of a prolonged evolutionary trajectory shaped by stable, resource-rich marine environments and the thermal pressures of increasingly cold southern waters. The Eocene represents the apex of this trajectory, the point at which ecological conditions, evolutionary history, and environmental stability aligned to produce birds of a scale that the penguin lineage has never approached since. The eventual disappearance of giant penguins was not immediate. The fossil record indicates that large-bodied species persisted into the Oligocene, approximately 25 to 30 million years ago, before their diversity collapsed. The most widely supported explanation for this decline involves the radiation of modern marine mammals, particularly pinnipeds and toothed whales, into the Southern Ocean during the late Eocene and Oligocene. These groups were, in many respects, ecological competitors and potential predators simultaneously. Their arrival introduced new pressures on prey populations and imposed new risks on surface-resting and near-shore foraging birds. Simultaneously, the Southern Ocean was cooling rapidly as Antarctic glaciation intensified following the separation of the continent from South America and the establishment of the Antarctic circumpolar current. The warm, productive coastal ecosystem that had supported giant penguins for millions of years was contracting, and the animals most dependent on its specific conditions were among the first to register the consequences. What the fossil record of Antarctic giant penguins ultimately documents is not an anomaly, but a coherent ecological system, one in which a lineage of marine birds, unconstrained by the predatory pressures and competitive dynamics that shaped penguin communities elsewhere, followed the logic of natural selection toward a body plan of remarkable scale. These animals were not improbable. They were the predictable outcome of the conditions that produced them and the coastlines they inhabited, warm, biologically productive, and ecologically stable. The coastlines that supported those towering birds were not bare or barren. Behind the beaches where giant penguins rested and molted, the land itself was alive in ways that the modern Antarctic landscape gives no indication of. Approximately 52 million years ago, during the early Eocene, Antarctica was a forested continent. This is not a tentative inference drawn from isolated fragments of biological evidence. It is a conclusion supported by multiple independent lines of geological and paleobotanical data, including fossil pollen assemblages, preserved leaf impressions, lignified wood samples, and stable isotope records extracted from ancient soil horizons. The landmass that now lies buried beneath an ice sheet, averaging 2.1 kilometers in thickness, was, during this period, covered in dense, continuous temperate rainforest, extending from its coastlines toward its interior, interrupted only by river systems, wetlands, and the topographic relief of its mountain ranges. The climate that sustained this forest was unlike anything currently found at polar latitudes, and understanding it requires setting aside the modern Antarctic environment almost entirely. The driving mechanism behind Antarctica's forested interval was the position of the continent combined with the configuration of global heat distribution during the Eocene. Atmospheric carbon dioxide concentrations during the early Eocene are estimated to have been between 1,000 and 2,000 parts per million, roughly 2 to 5 times current levels, producing a greenhouse effect intense enough to suppress polar ice formation entirely and to push mean annual temperatures at high southern latitudes to values between 10 and 16 degrees Celsius. These were not marginal conditions capable of supporting only sparse tundra vegetation. They were conditions comparable to those found today in the temperate rainforests of southern Chile or New Zealand's South Island, environments of high precipitation, mild winters, and sustained biological productivity. The forest itself was compositionally complex. Fossil pollen and spore records recovered from Antarctic sedimentary sequences document the presence of Northophagus, the southern beech genus that still dominates temperate forests across southern South America, New Zealand, and parts of Australia, alongside conifers related to modern podocarps and araucarias, tree ferns, flowering angiosperms, mosses, and dense ground-level fern communities. These were not simple low-diversity assemblages. The data indicate layered forest structures with canopy trees reaching substantial heights, understory shrubs and small trees occupying the mid-level, and a ground layer of ferns and mosses sustained by high moisture availability. Root trace fossils and fossil soil profiles from sites including the Antarctic Peninsula confirm that these forests were not merely present at coastal margins. They extended inland and persisted across landscape scales. One of the most consequential features of this environment was the photoperiod regime it imposed on its inhabitants. Antarctica's position at high southern latitudes meant that even during the Eocene, the continent experienced extreme seasonal variation in daylight. During summer, locations near the pole received continuous sunlight for weeks or months, with solar angles sufficient to drive vigorous photosynthesis across the growing season. During winter, the same locations experienced extended periods of darkness, lasting anywhere from several weeks to several months, depending on latitude. This seasonal light cycle had no direct parallel in lower latitude forest ecosystems, and the plants and animals that occupied Antarctic forests during the Eocene were operating under photoperiodic constraints that shaped their biology in ways distinct from their relatives elsewhere on the planet. The trees of the Antarctic Eocene forest addressed the winter darkness problem through a combination of deciduousness and physiological tolerance. Fossil evidence indicates that some Antarctic Notophagus populations were deciduous, shedding their leaves during the dark months and resuming growth rapidly once spring light returned, a strategy that conserved resources during a period when photosynthesis was impossible regardless of temperature. Other plant lineages appear to have been evergreen, relying on stored carbohydrates to sustain basic metabolic function through the dark season. The coexistence of both strategies within the same forest system mirrors patterns observed in modern high-latitude forests and suggests that the Antarctic Eocene plant community had diversified its resource management approaches in response to the unique demands of polar seasonality. Beneath the canopy, the forest floor supported a range of invertebrate life documented through fossil amber deposits and compression fossils recovered from Antarctic Peninsula sites. Beetles, flies, mites, and other arthropods are represented in the record, indicating active decomposer and pollinator communities consistent with a functioning forest ecosystem rather than a simplified or depauperate one. The presence of diverse insect fauna implies sufficient plant diversity and year-round resource availability to sustain populations through seasonal bottlenecks, a further indication that the forest was ecologically robust rather than marginal. Vertebrate life within the interior forests of Eocene Antarctica is less completely documented than the plant and invertebrate record, partly because forest interior environments are less conducive to fossil preservation than coastal or lacustrine settings. However, the faunal evidence that does exist, combined with biogeographic inference, supports the presence of diverse terrestrial vertebrate communities. Antarctica at this time remained connected or recently connected to South America, and faunal exchange between the two landmasses was possible. Marsupials, early placental mammals, and various reptilian lineages were present across the broader southern continent system, and their occurrence in Antarctic fossil deposits, though still incompletely sampled, is consistent with the forested environments that would have supported them. The rivers and wetlands embedded within the forest system added further habitat complexity. Sedimentary sequences from Antarctic sites record the presence of fluvial and lacustrine depositional environments during the Eocene, indicating active drainage networks carrying freshwater from elevated interior regions toward coastal plains. These waterways would have functioned as corridors for aquatic and semi-aquatic species, created habitat edges, supporting species requiring both terrestrial and aquatic resources, and deposited the fine-grained sediments most favorable to fossil preservation. It is partly for this reason that some of the best documented Antarctic Eocene fauna comes from near-coastal and low-elevation settings rather than forest interiors. The duration of Antarctica's forested interval was not brief. Temperate forest conditions persisted across the continent in various configurations and with fluctuating extent, from at least the early Eocene through the Middle Eocene, a span of roughly 10 to 15 million years, during which forested ecosystems were the dominant vegetational type across much of the landmass. This was not a transient anomaly, but a sustained ecological state, long enough for endemic species to evolve, for ecological communities to mature and diversify, and for the continent to accumulate a biological legacy quite distinct from anything that exists there today. The forests that covered Antarctica during this interval were, by any reasonable measure, among the most geographically remote and photoperiodically unusual forested ecosystems in Earth's history, and the organisms that inhabited them were shaped, in ways still being documented, by the specific and unrepeatable conditions of that place and time. The forests that covered Antarctica during the Eocene were themselves built on a much older biological foundation. Long before the southern beeches and podocarp conifers established their canopy across the continent, a different kind of forest had occupied the same latitudes, and a different class of animals had moved through it. During the late Cretaceous, between approximately 100 and 66 million years ago, Antarctica was home to dinosaurs. This is no longer a hypothesis requiring qualification. Fossil material recovered from the Antarctic Peninsula and surrounding island formations confirms the presence of multiple dinosaur lineages at high southern latitudes, living in an environment that imposed seasonal challenges unlike anything their lower latitude relatives would have encountered. The climate of late Cretaceous Antarctica was warmer than today by a substantial margin. Mean annual temperatures at Antarctic latitudes during this period are estimated to have fallen between 6 and 14 degrees Celsius, depending on the specific time interval and the proxy data used. Sea surface temperatures in surrounding waters were correspondingly elevated, and the continent itself carried no permanent ice sheet. Forests, dominated by conifers, tree ferns, ginkgos, and early flowering plants, covered significant portions of the landmass, and river systems drained interior highlands toward low-lying coastal plains where sediment accumulated and, occasionally, fossils were preserved. The environment was, in ecological terms, a functioning high-latitude forest biome, biologically productive across its growing season and capable of supporting complex food webs. What made this environment exceptional for its dinosaur inhabitants was not temperature, but light. Even during the Cretaceous, Antarctica's polar position meant that the continent experienced extreme photoperiodic seasonality. During the austral summer, locations at or near the pole received continuous daylight for weeks, with solar energy driving sustained plant growth across the forest understory and canopy. During the Austral winter, those same locations fell into prolonged darkness, periods lasting from several weeks to potentially 3 or 4 months, during which photosynthesis ceased entirely and temperatures dropped to levels that would have tested the physiological limits of any resident animal. This combination of warm, mean annual temperatures with extreme seasonal light variation created an ecological context with no precise modern analogue, and the dinosaurs that inhabited it were, by necessity, adapted to its demands. The dinosaur fauna of Antarctic Cretaceous deposits is documented primarily from sites on James Ross Island, Vega Island, and the broader Antarctic Peninsula region. The assemblage, though incompletely sampled due to the logistical difficulties of Antarctic fieldwork and the limited exposure of relevant geological formations, includes ankylosaurs, ornithopods, and theropods, a taxonomic spread indicating that both herbivorous and carnivorous components of a functioning dinosaur ecosystem were present. Among the herbivores, ornithopod dinosaurs related to the hypsilophodontid grade are represented, small to medium-bodied animals, capable of rapid locomotion and likely dependent on ground-level vegetation as their primary food source. Larger herbivores, including possible sauropod material, have also been reported from Antarctic Cretaceous sediments, though the evidence for these remains less complete. The presence of herbivorous dinosaurs at polar latitudes raises an immediate question about winter survival. Plant productivity at Antarctic latitudes during the Cretaceous winter would have dropped to near zero during the months of darkness, eliminating the food base that herbivores depended upon for the bulk of the year. Two broad strategies are available to large herbivores facing this kind of seasonal resource collapse: migration and physiological tolerance. Both have been proposed for polar dinosaurs, and the evidence bearing on each is instructive. Migration, the seasonal movement of herds between high-latitude summer feeding grounds and lower-latitude winter refugia, is well documented in modern large herbivores and would have been physically possible for dinosaurs capable of sustained locomotion over long distances. The distances involved, however, were substantial. Moving from Antarctic latitudes to regions where winter plant productivity remained meaningful would have required journeys of thousands of kilometers, comparable in scale to the longest migrations undertaken by any living vertebrate. Physiological tolerance presents an alternative that some researchers consider more plausible for at least a portion of the polar dinosaur fauna. Evidence accumulated over the past 3 decades indicates that many non-avian dinosaurs possessed metabolic rates elevated above those of modern reptiles, with some lineages likely approaching or achieving endothermy, the capacity to regulate body temperature internally through metabolic heat production. An endothermic or near endothermic dinosaur would have been better positioned to survive periods of food scarcity and temperature reduction than an ectothermic reptile of comparable size, though it would still have faced the fundamental challenge of maintaining energy balance during a prolonged winter fast. Bone histology studies of polar dinosaur specimens show rapid, continuous growth patterns rather than the seasonal growth rings characteristic of animals that enter dormancy, a finding consistent with year-round metabolic activity and suggestive of either residency through winter or arrival in spring, followed by intensive seasonal growth. The carnivorous component of the Antarctic dinosaur ecosystem is represented most clearly by theropod material, including teeth and fragmentary skeletal elements attributable to mid-sized predatory lineages. The presence of active predators in a polar ecosystem implies the sustained availability of prey through enough of the year to support their energetic requirements, a further indication that the Antarctic Cretaceous food web was not simply a summer phenomenon, but a year-round system capable of maintaining predator populations. Whether those predators remained resident through winter or followed prey populations in seasonal movements is not resolved by current evidence, but the ecological logic of predator-prey dynamics suggests that their distributions were closely tied to those of the herbivore populations they depended upon. Nesting behavior at high latitudes adds another dimension to the picture. Dinosaur eggs and nesting structures are known from polar regions of the Northern Hemisphere, and while direct nesting evidence from Antarctic Cretaceous deposits remains limited, the life history requirements of dinosaur reproduction are relevant to understanding polar residency. Egg incubation in non-avian dinosaurs required sustained warmth over periods of weeks to months, and the availability of sufficient summer warmth in Antarctic Cretaceous environments, where mean summer temperatures may have reached 12 to 15 degrees Celsius, would have made seasonal nesting feasible. Animals that nested at high latitudes during summer and then faced the onset of winter with newly hatched young would have confronted a particularly acute survival challenge, one that may have selected for rapid juvenile growth rates of the kind documented in the bone histology of some polar dinosaur specimens. The forest ecosystem within which Antarctic dinosaurs moved was itself a dynamic and seasonally variable system. During summer, the continuous daylight would have driven rapid and sustained plant growth, producing a flush of ground-level vegetation, new foliage, and fruiting bodies that represented concentrated food resources for herbivores. Insect populations, active during the warm months, would have supported smaller insectivorous dinosaurs and early birds. The forest understory, opened by the relatively low angle of polar sunlight, even during summer, may have supported a more continuous ground layer vegetation than lower latitude forests, where canopy shading suppresses understory productivity. During winter, the same forest would have presented a fundamentally different resource landscape: bare or dormant vegetation, reduced insect activity, and temperatures low enough to impose thermoregulatory costs on any resident endotherm. What the Antarctic Cretaceous record ultimately documents is a dinosaur fauna operating at the ecological frontier of its clade's geographic range. Animals pushed by the logic of resource competition and habitat availability into an environment that demanded physiological and behavioral responses beyond those required at lower latitudes. The evidence suggests they were not marginal inhabitants clinging to the edges of a hostile environment, but functional components of a complex polar ecosystem, one that operated according to the same ecological principles as lower latitude dinosaur communities, while being shaped by the specific and demanding conditions of a high latitude, strongly seasonal world. That world, like the forests above it, and the giant penguins that would follow tens of millions of years later, left its record in rock, fragmentary, incomplete, but sufficient to establish that Antarctica's biological history extends far deeper and far stranger than its present surface suggests. The dinosaurs that moved through Antarctica's Cretaceous forests were not the only large vertebrates shaping that ecosystem. Alongside them, and persisting well beyond the extinction event that ended the non-avian dinosaur lineages entirely, a group of reptiles occupied Antarctica's rivers, wetlands, and forested margins in numbers and diversity that the continent's current frozen state makes almost impossible to intuit. Crocodilians, the lineage that includes modern crocodiles, alligators, and gharials, were present in Antarctic ecosystems across an interval spanning tens of millions of years, and their fossil record on the continent documents not a peripheral or impoverished fauna, but a genuine crocodilian community adapted to high-latitude conditions that their living relatives would not tolerate today. The physiological baseline of modern crocodilians makes their Antarctic presence seem paradoxical at first consideration. Living species are ectothermic, dependent on environmental heat sources to regulate body temperature, and are effectively restricted to tropical and subtropical latitudes where mean annual temperatures remain high enough to sustain their metabolic requirements year-round. The southernmost populations of living crocodilians occur at latitudes no greater than approximately 38 degrees south, far short of the Antarctic Peninsula, which extends to nearly 65 degrees south, and far shorter still of the continental interior. The presence of crocodilians at Antarctic latitudes therefore requires a climate explanation, and that explanation is well supported by the geological record. During the Eocene, the interval from which the most significant Antarctic crocodilian fossil material derives, mean annual temperatures on the Antarctic Peninsula are estimated to have been between 10 and 17 degrees Celsius at sea level, with winter minima remaining above freezing across much of the low-elevation coastal zone. These were temperatures consistent with the thermal requirements of at least some crocodilian lineages, particularly those adapted to cooler or more seasonally variable environments than their tropical relatives. The warmth was not uniform across the continent or stable across the full duration of the Eocene, but for several million years during its early and middle phases, Antarctic coastal and lowland environments were climatically accessible to crocodilians in a way that has not been true at any point in the past 30 million years. The fossil evidence for Antarctic crocodilians is most thoroughly documented from Seymour Island, the same formation that has yielded the giant penguin material discussed earlier. From these deposits, researchers have recovered remains attributable to members of the broadly defined crocodiliform group, including forms related to the Sebecosuchians, a lineage of terrestrial or semi-terrestrial crocodile relatives characterized by laterally compressed, blade-like teeth suited to processing flesh rather than fish or invertebrates. Sebecosuchians were not aquatic ambush predators in the manner of modern Nile or saltwater crocodiles. They were more terrestrially capable animals, with more upright limb postures and dentition suggesting active pursuit or ambush of land-based prey. Their presence in Antarctic Eocene deposits indicates that the crocodilian fauna of the continent was not restricted to river margins and lake shores, but extended into forested terrestrial habitats as well. The rivers and wetland systems of Eocene Antarctica would have provided the primary habitat for more conventionally aquatic crocodilian forms. Sedimentary evidence from Antarctic peninsula sequences documents the presence of active fluvial systems, meandering rivers with floodplains, oxbow lakes, and seasonally inundated low-lying areas, all of which represent the habitat types most heavily utilized by living crocodilians. In these environments, crocodilians function as apex or near-apex aquatic predators, regulating prey populations, cycling nutrients through scavenging, and structuring the behavior of other animals through predation pressure. The ecological role they would have played in Antarctic Eocene waterways was likely comparable to the role their relatives play in tropical river systems today, scaled to the prey available in a high-latitude freshwater ecosystem. That prey community would have included fish, documented from Antarctic Eocene deposits in moderate diversity, as well as amphibians, freshwater invertebrates, and the various terrestrial vertebrates that came to water's edge to drink or forage. The giant penguins that occupied the nearby coastline were almost certainly not prey items for inland crocodilians, given the ecological separation between marine and freshwater habitats, but smaller birds, early mammals, and lizard-grade reptiles would have been within the size range of available crocodilian prey. The predator-prey dynamics of these freshwater systems, though reconstructible only in broad outline from the available fossil record, indicate a functioning and ecologically structured aquatic community rather than an impoverished one. Seasonal behavior would have been a significant factor shaping crocodilian life at Antarctic latitudes. Modern crocodilians show strong behavioral responses to temperature variation even within their tropical and subtropical ranges, becoming less active and reducing feeding during cooler months. At the latitudes and temperatures characterizing Eocene Antarctica, seasonal temperature variation, combined with the extreme photoperiodic cycle of long polar summers and extended winter darkness, would have imposed a pronounced annual rhythm on crocodilian activity. During summer months, warm temperatures and high prey availability would have supported active foraging, growth, and reproduction. During winter, reduced temperatures and diminished prey activity would have necessitated metabolic depression and reduced movement, a behavioral pattern broadly consistent with the facultative dormancy observed in modern crocodilians during cool periods. Reproduction presents a particular constraint for ectothermic animals at high latitudes. Modern crocodilians are nest builders, depositing eggs in constructed mounds or excavated holes and relying on ambient heat, from decomposing vegetation, solar radiation, or both, to incubate eggs over periods of 60 to 90 days. Successful incubation requires sustained warmth within a relatively narrow temperature range, and the availability of sufficient summer warmth in Eocene Antarctica to meet these requirements would have been a limiting factor on crocodilian reproductive success at the highest latitudes. The fossil distribution of Antarctic crocodilian material, concentrated in coastal and lower elevation sites rather than interior or high elevation localities, may partly reflect this reproductive constraint, populations persisting where summer warmth was most reliably sufficient to complete incubation before the onset of winter cooling. The eventual disappearance of crocodilians from Antarctica was a consequence of the same broad climatic trajectory that transformed the continent's entire ecosystem. As global temperatures declined through the late Eocene and into the Oligocene, driven by changing ocean circulation patterns associated with the opening of the Drake Passage between Antarctica and South America, the thermal conditions that had made Antarctic latitudes habitable for crocodilians contracted and eventually ceased to exist. The process was not instantaneous. Crocodilian lineages are physiologically flexible within limits, and populations under cooling pressure would have tracked favorable thermal conditions toward lower latitudes and lower elevations as the climate shifted. But the direction of change was consistent and ultimately decisive. By the early Oligocene, approximately 33 to 34 million years ago, the conditions that had sustained crocodilians in Antarctic ecosystems for tens of millions of years had deteriorated beyond the tolerance range of any known crocodilian lineage, and the group's presence on the continent ended, leaving behind only the fossil material that now documents, with quiet precision, the scale of what was lost. The ocean that sustained those predators and the forests that lined the continent behind them did not remain undisturbed. Approximately 66 million years ago, the biological continuity of Antarctic ecosystems was interrupted by an event of global scope. The Chicxulub impactor, an asteroid approximately 10 to 12 kilometers in diameter, struck the shallow marine platform of what is now the Yucatan Peninsula at a velocity estimated between 20 and 30 kilometers per second, releasing energy equivalent to billions of nuclear warheads and initiating a cascade of environmental disruptions that propagated across the entire planet within days, weeks, and months. The immediate effects: thermal pulse, ejecta fallout, megatsunami propagation across ocean basins, were followed by a prolonged period of atmospheric opacity caused by sulfate aerosols and soot from global wildfires, reducing solar input at the surface to levels insufficient to sustain photosynthesis across much of the planet for an estimated 1 to 2 years. The result was the end Cretaceous mass extinction, which eliminated approximately 75% of all species on Earth, including every lineage of non-avian dinosaurs. Antarctica was not shielded from these effects by its geographic position. Darkness does not respect latitude, and the collapse of photosynthetic productivity that followed the impact would have been as complete at high southern latitudes as anywhere else on the planet. The forests that had covered the continent, the food webs that had structured its terrestrial ecosystems, and the dinosaur fauna that had occupied its forested environments for tens of millions of years, were all subject to the same cascade of disruptions that devastated ecosystems globally. The polar forests, already adapted to seasonal darkness through deciduous strategies and stored carbohydrate reserves, may have had marginally greater physiological tolerance for the impact winter than lower latitude evergreen systems. But the duration and severity of the post-impact productivity collapse far exceeded the seasonal darkness these plants had evolved to manage. What survived in Antarctica, as globally, was a taxonomically reduced and ecologically simplified set of lineages. Organisms capable of persisting through the collapse of primary productivity, either by exploiting stored organic matter, by scavenging, by dietary generalism, or by physiological tolerance of prolonged food deprivation. Small body size was a significant advantage in this context, reducing absolute energetic requirements and making survival on intermittent or low-quality food sources more feasible. The survivors of the end Cretaceous extinction in Antarctic terrestrial environments were therefore disproportionately drawn from among the smaller, more generalist components of the pre-extinction fauna, and it was from this reduced founding community that the post-extinction ecosystems of the continent would be rebuilt. The recovery of Antarctic terrestrial ecosystems following the extinction was not instantaneous. Paleobotanical records from high-latitude southern hemisphere sites indicate an initial post-extinction interval dominated by ferns, the classic fern spike documented globally in the immediate aftermath of the impact, representing the rapid colonization of disturbed ground by spore-bearing plants capable of re-establishing from resistant spores before seed-bearing plants could recover. This fern-dominated phase was transient, lasting on the order of thousands of years rather than millions, and was followed by the gradual re-establishment of more complex plant communities as surviving tree lineages regenerated from root systems, seed banks, and refugial populations that had persisted through the extinction interval at lower latitudes or in locally sheltered environments. As the plant communities recovered, the animal lineages that had survived the extinction began to diversify into the ecological space vacated by the dinosaurs. Among the most significant of these in the Antarctic context were the mammals. Mammalian lineages had been present in Antarctic ecosystems during the Cretaceous, but as small, ecologically marginal animals operating in the shadow of a dinosaur fauna that dominated the large-bodied vertebrate niches. With the removal of non-avian dinosaurs, those constraints were lifted. The early Paleocene and Eocene fossil record of high southern latitudes documents the expansion of mammalian body size and ecological diversity into roles that had previously been occupied by dinosaurian herbivores, omnivores, and smaller predators. The mammalian fauna that emerged in post-extinction Antarctic and subantarctic environments was shaped by the biogeographic connections that existed at the time. Antarctica remained linked to South America through the early Paleogene, and this connection allowed faunal exchange between the two landmasses. Marsupials, the pouched mammals that dominate the modern Australian fauna and are represented in South America by opossums and their relatives, were among the lineages that moved through this connection, and their remains have been recovered from Eocene Antarctic deposits on Seymour Island. These were not the large, specialized marsupials of later Australian evolution, but rather smaller, more generalized animals, insectivores, omnivores, and early herbivores, occupying the lower and middle tiers of the post-extinction food web. Into the herbivore niches left vacant by ornithopod and other dinosaurian plant-eaters, a variety of mammalian lineages expanded during the Paleocene and Eocene. The specific mammalian taxa occupying Antarctic ecosystems during this interval are incompletely documented, but the broader South American record, to which Antarctica was connected, shows a rapid diversification of ungulate-grade mammals, early xenothrans, and other herbivorous lineages filling the large herbivore ecological space within a few million years of the extinction. It is reasonable to infer that some portion of this diversification extended into Antarctic environments, particularly during the early Eocene, when Antarctic climates were warmest and most hospitable to diverse mammalian faunas. The predator niches of post-extinction Antarctica were filled by a combination of mammalian carnivores and, strikingly, by large flightless birds. The flourished, commonly referred to as terror birds, were a lineage of large, flightless, predatory birds that originated in South America during the Paleocene and persisted into the Pliocene. Characterized by massive, hooked bills capable of delivering powerful strikes, long legs adapted for pursuit locomotion, and body masses, in the largest species, exceeding 150 kilograms, flourished occupied the apex terrestrial predator niche across much of South America for tens of millions of years. Given the faunal connections between South America and Antarctica during the early Paleogene, and the presence of suitable forested and open-ground habitats in Antarctic Eocene environments, the extension of flourished or flourished-related predatory birds into Antarctic ecosystems is considered plausible by researchers working on southern high-latitude faunas, though direct fossil confirmation from Antarctic deposits remains limited. What the post-extinction interval in Antarctica ultimately represents is a continent in ecological transition, its ancient dinosaurian communities replaced by a new assemblage of mammals and birds that were themselves still in the early phases of their evolutionary diversification. The forests were recovering, the climate remained warm, and the ecological space available to colonizing lineages was, by the standards of most intervals in Earth history, exceptionally open. The animals that moved into that space did so not into a simplified or impoverished environment, but into one that was actively rebuilding its complexity, layer by layer, lineage by lineage, across the millions of years that followed the extinction, producing an Antarctic ecosystem that would, by the Eocene, rival in biological richness almost anything the continent had supported before. The rivers and wetlands that sustained crocodilians were hydrologically connected to a coastline, and that coastline opened onto an ocean. During the Eocene, the seas surrounding Antarctica were not the frigid, storm-driven waters of the modern Southern Ocean. They were warmer, more stratified, and biologically productive in ways that supported a marine community of exceptional diversity and, in several lineages, exceptional size. The same climatic conditions that allowed forests to grow at polar latitudes and crocodilians to occupy Antarctic river systems also maintained sea surface temperatures in the surrounding ocean at levels sufficient to sustain warm water species assemblages, drive high primary productivity, and support food chains of considerable complexity. What lived in those waters constitutes one of the more striking chapters in the biological history of the Southern Hemisphere. Primary productivity in the Eocene Southern Ocean was sustained by nutrient upwelling along continental margins and by the high solar input of polar summers, which drove intense phytoplankton blooms during the months of continuous daylight. These blooms formed the base of a food web that extended upward through zooplankton, small fish, and invertebrates to large predatory vertebrates at the apex. The structure of this food web was broadly comparable to that of modern productive ocean systems, but its specific membership was radically different, populated by lineages that have since contracted, diversified into different forms, or disappeared entirely, and operating without the dominant large predators that characterize today's Southern Ocean. Among the most ecologically significant components of the Eocene Southern Ocean fauna were the giant penguins already documented from coastal fossil deposits. In the marine context, these animals were not simply large seabirds. They were mid to large apex predators capable of accessing prey at depth and in open water in ways that smaller contemporaries could not. Palaeodiptes, at an estimated mass of up to 115 kilograms, would have been a pursuit predator of considerable capability, capable of sustained high-speed underwater locomotion using its enlarged rigid flippers in a flight stroke motion that generates thrust comparable to, and in some respects more efficient than, the swimming mechanics of modern penguins. At depth, beyond the reach of most competing seabirds, these animals would have encountered fish and cephalopod populations in near-exclusive conditions, a resource partition that helps explain both their large size and their apparent abundance in the fossil record of coastal Eocene Antarctic sites. The fish fauna of the Eocene Southern Ocean was diverse and included lineages now extinct or restricted to other ocean basins. Teleost fishes, the dominant group of bony fishes in modern oceans, were well represented, with both open water schooling species and larger solitary predatory forms. The presence of large predatory fish in the Eocene Southern Ocean is significant because it indicates a food web with sufficient energetic throughput to sustain multiple trophic levels of large-bodied vertebrates simultaneously. Isotopic evidence from marine sediments of this period is consistent with high biological productivity and active nutrient cycling across the water column, conditions that would have supported dense prey populations and, by extension, the large predators dependent on them. Sharks were present in Eocene Southern Ocean waters and are documented from tooth material recovered in Antarctic and subantarctic sedimentary sequences. The assemblage includes representatives of lineages related to modern mackerel sharks and requiem sharks, as well as forms less clearly assignable to living groups. Among the most consequential of the Eocene shark fauna in terms of ecological impact were large lamniform species, active, warm-bodied pursuit predators capable of sustained swimming at speed and of targeting prey at or near the size of giant penguins. Whether large sharks routinely predated on Anthropornis or Palaeodiptes is not directly demonstrable from the fossil record, but predation pressure from large sharks would have been a consistent selective force acting on penguin behavior, influencing where and how deeply they dove, how long they remained at the surface, and how they used coastal habitat structure for refuge. The evolution of large body size in penguins may itself have been partly driven by predation pressure, larger individuals being more difficult targets for all but the largest sharks. The early history of whales intersects with the Eocene Southern Ocean in a particularly significant way. The cetacean lineage had originated in South Asian shallow marine environments approximately 50 to 53 million years ago, and had diversified rapidly through the Eocene, with fully aquatic forms appearing and spreading into ocean basins worldwide by the Middle Eocene. By the late Eocene, protocetid and basilosaurid whales, elongated, fully marine animals ranging from 4 to 18 meters in length, had reached the Southern Ocean, and their fossil remains have been recovered from Antarctic peninsula deposits. Basilosaurids, the larger forms, were apex predators in the ecosystems they entered, with robust dentition capable of processing large prey, including fish, smaller marine mammals, and potentially seabirds at the surface. Their arrival in southern waters introduced a new category of predator into an ecosystem that had previously been structured around sharks and large fish as the dominant large carnivores. The interaction between early whales and giant penguins in Eocene Southern Ocean ecosystems is not documented in direct behavioral terms, but ecological inference is informative. Basilosaurids, as surface and shallow water predators with dentition suited to seizing large prey, would have been capable of taking penguins at the surface or during shallow dives. The temporal overlap between basilosaurid whales and giant penguins in Antarctic fossil deposits indicates that these animals shared the same marine environment for a geologically meaningful interval, and the predation pressure imposed by large cetaceans would have added to the suite of selective forces acting on penguin body size, behavior, and habitat use. It is a reasonable inference that the ecological community of the Eocene Southern Ocean was, in part, structured by the interactions among these large-bodied vertebrate predators. Marine birds other than penguins contributed significantly to the Eocene Southern Ocean ecosystem. The Eocene is also the period during which the Procellariform lineage, the group that includes modern albatrosses, petrels, and shearwaters, was diversifying and expanding its geographic range. These birds, surface feeders, and shallow plunge divers occupied a different foraging niche than the deep-diving penguins, concentrating on prey within the uppermost meters of the water column. Their presence in southern waters during the Eocene is inferred from both body fossil material and the ecological requirements of their modern descendants, which are among the most abundant seabirds in today's Southern Ocean. The coexistence of surface foraging Procellariiforms with deep-diving giant penguins in the same coastal ecosystem would have minimized direct dietary competition, while collectively intensifying predation pressure across the full vertical extent of the nearshore water column. Invertebrate communities in the Eocene Southern Ocean were themselves diverse and ecologically significant. Cephalopods, squids and nautiloids, are documented from Eocene Antarctic marine deposits and represent a prey category of high importance for both penguins and large fish. Bivalves and gastropods colonized the shallow seafloor, supporting benthic food webs and providing resources for bottom-feeding species. Echinoderms, including sea urchins and brittle stars, contributed to sediment processing and nutrient cycling on the continental shelf. The overall picture is of a shallow marine ecosystem with high species richness distributed across multiple trophic levels. A system capable of sustaining large vertebrate predators at the apex precisely because the lower trophic levels were themselves productive and diverse. The geographic configuration of the Eocene Southern Ocean amplified these biological dynamics. Antarctica at this time was still connected to South America along the Scotia Arc, and the seaway between the two landmasses was narrower and shallower than it would later become. This configuration restricted the free circulation of cold, deep water around the continent and maintained the thermal stratification of southern surface waters at levels favorable to high productivity. The absence of the Antarctic circumpolar current, the powerful, unimpeded flow of cold water that dominates the modern Southern Ocean and drives its characteristic temperature regime, meant that Eocene southern waters retained warmth more effectively and maintained biological conditions more similar to lower latitude productive ocean systems. It was this oceanographic context, as much as any single biological factor, that made the Eocene Southern Ocean capable of sustaining the community of large, diverse, and ecologically complex vertebrates that the fossil record documents. The water was warm enough, productive enough, and stable enough across millions of years to allow predator lineages to reach sizes and ecological dominance that the cold, current-swept Southern Ocean of today cannot support. The mammals that inherited Antarctica's post-extinction landscape did so quietly, by the standards of evolutionary history. There was no sudden radiation visible in a single geological horizon, no dramatic faunal turnover captured in a discrete fossil layer. Instead, across the early Paleogene, the interval spanning roughly 66 to 34 million years ago, mammalian lineages expanded incrementally into the ecological roles vacated by the dinosaurs, diversifying in body size, dietary specialization, and habitat use as the recovering forests provided increasing structural complexity and resource availability. The result, by the Middle Eocene, was a terrestrial fauna of genuine ecological depth, one that the fragmentary nature of the Antarctic fossil record has only partially revealed, and that ongoing fieldwork continues to document in incremental but meaningful ways. The primary window into Antarctica's Paleogene mammal fauna is the La Meseta Formation on Seymour Island, a sedimentary sequence deposited during the Middle to Late Eocene and representing one of the most productive fossil sites in the entire Antarctic region. From these deposits, researchers have recovered mammalian material representing several distinct lineages, preserved in the kinds of near-coastal sedimentary environments, river mouths, shallow marine margins, tidal flats, that concentrate fossil material from both terrestrial and aquatic habitats. The assemblage is taxonomically diverse relative to what might be expected from a high-latitude Eocene site, and it reflects a continent that was, during this interval, both ecologically productive and faunally connected to the broader southern landmass system. Marsupials are among the best documented components of the La Meseta mammal fauna. The specimens recovered include representatives of lineages related to South American marsupial groups, consistent with the faunal exchange made possible by the land connection that persisted between Antarctica and South America through the early Paleogene. These animals were not large. The marsupial material from Antarctic Eocene deposits represents small to medium-bodied animals, likely ranging from mouse-sized insectivores to rat-sized omnivores, occupying the lower tiers of the terrestrial food web. Their presence in Antarctic deposits is significant, not because of their individual ecological impact, but because of what it implies about the broader connectivity and diversity of the southern mammal fauna. These animals did not evolve in isolation on Antarctica, but were part of a continuous southern landmass community whose members moved freely across the land bridges that linked the continent to South America. Alongside the marsupials, The La Meseta Formation has yielded material attributable to early ungulate-grade mammals, animals related to the condylarths and early South American ungulates that were diversifying rapidly across the Paleocene and Eocene of the southern continent. These animals occupied herbivore niches in the post-extinction ecosystem, processing the vegetation of Antarctica's Eocene forests and wetlands, and forming the prey base for whatever predatory mammals and birds shared their environment. Their body sizes, inferred from dental and skeletal fragments, ranged from small to medium, consistent with the forested, structurally complex environments of Eocene Antarctica, where large open-ground herbivores would have had limited habitat advantage compared to smaller, more maneuverable animals capable of navigating dense vegetation. The dentition of the herbivorous mammals recovered from Antarctic Eocene deposits provides dietary information of considerable specificity. Tooth morphology in mammals is closely tied to diet. The cusps, ridges, and enamel thickness of individual teeth reflect the mechanical properties of the food being processed. The herbivorous mammals of the La Meseta Formation show dental patterns consistent with browsing on soft vegetation, fruit consumption, and mixed omnivory, rather than the high-crowned teeth associated with grazing on abrasive grasses. This is consistent with the forested environment these animals inhabited, where ground-level grasses were absent. Grasses did not diversify into ecologically dominant ground covers until the Miocene, and the primary plant resources available to herbivores were leaves, fruits, seeds, and soft stems. The insectivorous component of Antarctica's Eocene mammal fauna is less completely documented but inferentially significant. Modern forest ecosystems support diverse insectivorous mammal communities. Shrews, hedgehogs, moles, and various marsupial equivalents. And the insect fauna of Eocene Antarctica, documented from amber and compression fossils, was sufficiently diverse to support a comparable community of small insectivores. The recovery of insect diversity following the end Cretaceous extinction was relatively rapid, and by the early Eocene, arthropod communities in high-latitude forests were broadly comparable in diversity to those at lower latitudes. This would have provided a consistent and seasonally variable food base for small insectivorous mammals, with summer months offering peak insect abundance and winter months requiring dietary flexibility or the use of stored energy reserves. Seasonal adaptation in Antarctic Eocene mammals would have been a significant selective pressure. The extreme photoperiodic cycle of high polar latitudes, months of continuous summer daylight followed by extended winter darkness, imposed metabolic and behavioral demands on resident mammals that their lower latitude relatives did not face. Modern mammals at high latitudes respond to seasonal resource scarcity through a range of strategies: hibernation, torpor, fat storage, dietary switching, and migration. The mammals of Eocene Antarctica, living in a climate warmer than the modern Arctic or subarctic, but still subject to the same photoperiodic extremes, would have been subject to comparable selective pressures. Whether Antarctic Eocene mammals use torpor or hibernation is not directly determinable from fossil material, but the metabolic flexibility required to survive polar winters would have been a consistent feature of successful resident lineages. The aquatic margins of Eocene Antarctica supported mammalian life as well. Among the most intriguing components of the La Meseta fauna are early representatives of Astropotheres and possibly other large South American ungulate lineages whose remains occur in near-coastal deposits, suggesting that some larger mammals were utilizing the wetland and riverine habitats of the Antarctic coastal zone. These animals, though poorly known from Antarctic material specifically, represent a size class medium to large-bodied terrestrial herbivores that would have been ecologically significant as prey for larger predators and as modifiers of riparian vegetation through browsing and trampling. Their presence in Antarctic Eocene deposits, even if documented only fragmentarily, indicates that the mammalian fauna of the continent was not restricted to small-bodied forest dwellers, but included animals of sufficient size to structure vegetation dynamics and support larger predator lineages. The predatory mammals of Eocene Antarctica remain among the least well-documented components of the fauna, partly because predator populations are inherently smaller than prey populations and therefore less likely to be represented in fossil assemblages of limited sample size. South American Eocene faunas include sparassodont marsupials, a diverse lineage of carnivorous marsupial relatives that independently evolved saber-tooth-like and pursuit predator body plans, and the biogeographic connection between South America and Antarctica makes the presence of sparassodonts in Antarctic Eocene ecosystems a reasonable inference even in the absence of confirmed fossil material. These animals filled the large predatory mammal niche across South America for tens of millions of years, and the forested, prey-rich environments of Eocene Antarctica would have been ecologically suitable for their occupation. What the fossil record of Antarctica's Paleogene mammals ultimately reveals is a continent participating fully in the broader evolutionary and ecological history of the southern landmass system, not an isolated backwater, but an integral component of a connected southern biotic region whose faunal composition reflected both local environmental conditions and the ongoing exchange of lineages across land connections that have since been severed. The mammals of Eocene Antarctica were, in most respects, southern South American mammals living at the geographic extremity of their range, shaped by the specific demands of high-latitude forest life, but continuous in their evolutionary relationships with the broader fauna of the southern continent. That continuity, biological, geographic, and evolutionary, was itself a product of Antarctica's position within a still connected southern landmass, and its eventual disruption as the continent drifted toward isolation and the climate shifted toward cooling would prove to be one of the most consequential biogeographic events in the history of the Southern Hemisphere. The isolation that Antarctica had achieved by the early Oligocene was not merely geographic. It was the precondition for a climatic transformation of a kind that the planet had not experienced at southern high latitudes for tens of millions of years, and its consequences unfolded across a timescale long enough to encompass the rise and fall of entire ecological communities. The cooling that followed the establishment of the Antarctic circumpolar current was not a single episode with a defined beginning and end. It was a progressive, multi-phased deterioration, punctuated by intervals of partial stabilization and occasional minor warming, but moving consistently in one direction across the tens of millions of years that separated the warm Eocene from the glaciated Antarctica of the present. Understanding that cooling requires tracking it not as a background condition, but as an active geological process with measurable rates, discrete thresholds, and cascading biological consequences at every stage. The first major threshold was crossed approximately 33.9 million years ago at the Eocene-Oligocene boundary, one of the most significant climatic transitions in the Cenozoic record. Proxy data derived from oxygen isotope ratios in deep-sea foraminifera, organisms whose shell chemistry records the temperature and ice volume of the ocean water in which they lived, document a sharp shift at this boundary consistent with a global temperature drop of approximately 4 to 5 degrees Celsius, occurring over a geologically brief interval estimated at less than 400,000 years. Accompanying this temperature shift was a significant increase in global ice volume, indicating the rapid growth of a substantial Antarctic ice sheet, the first permanent, large-scale glaciation of the continent since the Carboniferous, more than 250 million years earlier. This event, referred to in the literature as the Eocene-Oligocene transition or the OI-1 glaciation event, marks the moment at which Antarctica crossed from a partly glaciated continent with extensive ice-free habitats into a continent where permanent ice had become the dominant surface feature over much of its area. The mechanisms driving this transition involved the interaction of multiple factors operating simultaneously: declining atmospheric carbon dioxide concentrations through the late Eocene, driven by increased silicate weathering, changing volcanic outgassing rates, and enhanced ocean carbon burial, had been reducing the global greenhouse effect incrementally for millions of years before the transition. The opening of the Drake Passage and the intensification of the Antarctic circumpolar current removed the oceanographic mechanism by which equatorial heat had previously been delivered to southern high latitudes. These two processes, acting together, pushed Antarctic surface temperatures across the threshold at which winter snowfall could survive the summer melt season, the critical condition for the initiation of permanent glaciation. Once established, the ice sheet generated its own reinforcing feedback. The high albedo of ice and snow reflects solar radiation that bare ground or vegetation would absorb, reducing surface warming and promoting further ice retention. This ice albedo feedback accelerated the glaciation once it had begun, making the transition self-reinforcing rather than dependent on continued external forcing. The ecological consequences of the Eocene-Oligocene transition registered simultaneously across terrestrial and marine environments. On land, the forests that had already been simplifying through the late Eocene contracted sharply as temperatures fell and precipitation patterns shifted. Pollen records from Antarctic peninsula sites and from ocean sediment cores surrounding the continent document a rapid decline in arboreal pollen, the microscopic signature of forest cover, coinciding with the OI-1 event, replaced by assemblages indicative of open, cold-tolerant vegetation types, more comparable to modern tundra than to the temperate rainforests of the earlier Eocene. Tree lines retreated to lower elevations and lower latitudes as the thermal envelope capable of supporting woody vegetation compressed toward the coast and ultimately toward the northern extremity of the Antarctic Peninsula, the last region of the continent to retain conditions marginally compatible with forest growth. The mammals that had occupied Antarctic forests through the Eocene faced conditions for which their evolutionary history had not prepared them. The Eocene warming had been the context within which their lineages had diversified and expanded. The forests were their habitat, the insects and fruits of those forests their food, and the mild temperatures of polar summers the climatic envelope within which their physiology operated. As that envelope contracted, the options available to resident mammal populations were limited and increasingly constrained. Migration northward, along whatever residual land connections or island chains remained accessible across the Drake Passage region, would have been the most effective response, and the fossil record of South American Paleogene mammals is consistent with the arrival of lineages that may have tracked suitable habitat northward from deteriorating Antarctic environments during this interval. But for populations that could not migrate or that were already restricted to the most isolated portions of the continent, the alternative was local extinction, the disappearance of populations too small, too isolated, or too specialized to persist through conditions outside the range their physiology could accommodate. The marine environment surrounding Antarctica underwent a parallel transformation As surface temperatures in the Southern Ocean declined through the Oligocene, the warm water species assemblages that had characterized the Eocene coastal ecosystem were progressively replaced by cold-adapted fauna. The diversity of fish lineages in Antarctic waters declined as thermophilic species retreated northward following the contracting boundary of warm surface water. The giant penguin fauna, whose diversity and abundance had peaked during the Eocene, entered a period of decline that would ultimately result in their complete extinction. A process driven not by a single catastrophic event, but by the cumulative pressure of changing ocean temperatures, shifting prey availability, and intensifying competition from the expanding pinnipeds and toothed whales that were diversifying rapidly through the Oligocene and Miocene. The cold, nutrient-rich water that replaced the warm Eocene ocean was not biologically unproductive. It would eventually support the krill-based food web of the modern Southern Ocean, but it supported a fundamentally different community, one structured around cold-adapted specialists rather than the warm water generalists of the earlier epoch. Glaciation advanced across the Antarctic interior in phases rather than continuously. Ice cores and sedimentary records indicate that the growth of the Antarctic ice sheet through the Oligocene and Miocene was not monotonic, but punctuated by intervals of partial retreat during warmer periods. Glacial interglacial cycles, operating on timescales of tens to hundreds of thousands of years, driven by orbital variations in Earth's distance from and orientation toward the Sun. During warmer intervals, ice margins retreated, coastal habitats became transiently more accessible, and remnant plant communities may have temporarily expanded into areas that ice had previously covered. During colder phases, the ice advanced again, compressing whatever biological communities had established themselves in ice-free coastal zones. Each cycle of advance and retreat reduced the total area of ice-free habitat available on the continent and increased the isolation of the biological communities that persisted within it. By the Middle Miocene, approximately 14 million years ago, a second major glaciation event, sometimes referred to as the Middle Miocene climate transition, drove Antarctic temperatures to their lowest values since the Eocene-Oligocene boundary and initiated the growth of the East Antarctic ice sheet to approximately its modern extent. This event effectively ended whatever marginal terrestrial ecosystems had persisted on the Antarctic continent through the Oligocene and early Miocene. The ice sheet that grew during and after the Middle Miocene transition was not a temporary feature subject to the kind of partial retreat seen during earlier glacial cycles. It was a stable, self-reinforcing glaciation grounded on bedrock well below sea level in much of its western sector, making it resistant to the modest warming pulses that had previously driven interglacial retreats. The biological communities of Antarctica, whatever had survived the preceding 20 million years of progressive cooling, were now confined to the northernmost coastal fringe of the continent and to the sub-Antarctic islands that lay beyond the ice margin entirely. The slow freezing of Antarctica did not announce itself as a crisis to any individual organism or population. Each generation experienced conditions only marginally different from those of the previous generation, and the adaptive responses available at the individual and population level, behavioral flexibility, dietary switching, range shifts, were adequate to buffer the immediate effects of year-to-year and decade-to-decade variation. It was only across the timescales of thousands and millions of years that the cumulative direction of change became biologically decisive, progressively narrowing the range of conditions under which life could persist on the continent, until that range had contracted to the coastal margins and the surrounding ocean. the only environments where Antarctica still sustains biological communities today. The ice that now covers the continent's interior is not simply frozen water. It is the accumulated physical record of a climatic transformation that unfolded across tens of millions of years and erased, layer by layer and degree by degree, one of the most biologically remarkable ecosystems that the high latitudes of this planet have ever supported. The mammals that occupied Antarctica's Eocene forests were living without any indication available to them on borrowed time. Not in any immediate ecological sense, but in the deeper geological sense that the landmass beneath them was in motion. Antarctica had not always occupied its current position of near-perfect polar isolation. Through the Mesozoic and into the early Paleogene, it had been part of the broader Gondwanan landmass system, physically connected to South America along its western margin and to Australia along its eastern margin, and these connections had been the conduits through which the faunal exchanges documented in the fossil record had occurred. The marsupials, the early ungulates, the sporacodont predators, and the various plant lineages that constituted the Antarctic Eocene ecosystem had all arrived or diversified through those connections. Their continued presence depended, in ways that would only become apparent over millions of years, on the persistence of the geographic and climatic conditions those connections helped maintain. The separation of Antarctica from its neighboring continents was not a single event, but a prolonged process driven by the same plate tectonic forces that had been reshaping the configuration of southern landmasses since the Jurassic breakup of Gondwana. Australia began its northward drift away from Antarctica approximately 45 to 50 million years ago during the Middle Eocene. The separation was initially slow. The two continents remained close enough that shallow marine environments persisted between them, and some degree of biological exchange may have continued across island chains and shallow seaways for several million years after the initial separation. But the direction of movement was consistent, and its consequences cumulative. As Australia moved north, the seaway between the two continents deepened and widened, eventually allowing the unrestricted flow of ocean water around the Antarctic continent for the first time in its geological history. The separation from South America followed a different timeline and had arguably more immediate climatic consequences. The connection between Antarctica and South America, maintained through the Scotia Arc region at the tip of the Antarctic Peninsula, persisted longer than the Australian connection, remaining as a partially emergent land bridge or series of island stepping stones until approximately 30 to 34 million years ago, near the Eocene-Oligocene boundary. The precise timing of the final opening of the Drake Passage, the deep water seaway between the southern tip of South America and the Antarctic Peninsula, remains a subject of active research, with different proxy datasets suggesting somewhat different dates. What is agreed upon is that by the early Oligocene, deep water circulation through the Drake Passage had been established, and the consequences for Antarctic climate were immediate and severe. The opening of the Drake Passage completed the geographic precondition for the formation of the Antarctic Circumpolar Current, the largest ocean current on Earth by volume transport, moving approximately 130 to 150 million cubic meters of water per second in an uninterrupted circumpolar flow around the Antarctic continent. This current, once established, acted as a thermal barrier of extraordinary effectiveness. By circulating cold water continuously around Antarctica without interruption by continental landmasses, it prevented the poleward transport of warm surface water from lower latitudes and isolated the Antarctic continent thermally from the rest of the global ocean system. Mean annual sea surface temperatures around Antarctica dropped sharply as the current intensified, and atmospheric temperatures over the continent followed. The greenhouse warmth that had sustained Antarctic forests, crocodilians, and diverse mammal faunas for tens of millions of years was being systematically eroded by a change in ocean circulation could compensate for. The ecological consequences of this oceanographic transition registered across every component of the Antarctic ecosystem. Plant communities, the foundation of the terrestrial food web, were the first to show large-scale structural change. Pollen records from Antarctic and subantarctic sedimentary sequences document a progressive shift in vegetation composition through the late Eocene and into the Oligocene, a decline in the diversity and abundance of thermophilic plant taxa, a reduction in the complexity of forest structure, and an increasing dominance of cold-tolerant Nothofagus species over the more diverse assemblage of conifers, angiosperms, and tree ferns that had characterized the earlier Eocene forests. The forests did not disappear instantaneously, but they were simplifying, losing species, losing structural complexity, and retreating from higher elevations and more exposed positions as thermal conditions deteriorated. The animal communities dependent on those forests contracted in parallel. Mammals requiring the resources of a diverse, productive forest, fruit, seeds, insects, soft browse, faced diminishing habitat as the vegetation simplified and seasonal resource availability became more extreme. Species with narrow thermal tolerances or specialized dietary requirements were the first to be affected, either going locally extinct or tracking suitable habitat northward along the remaining connections to South America. The biological exchange that had previously moved lineages southward into Antarctica now operated primarily in reverse, as animals displaced by deteriorating Antarctic conditions moved northward toward more hospitable environments on the South American continent. The marine ecosystem surrounding Antarctica was transformed by the same oceanographic changes. The establishment of the Antarctic circumpolar current altered nutrient distribution, upwelling patterns, and thermal stratification across the Southern Ocean in ways that fundamentally restructured its biological community. Species adapted to the warmer, more stratified Eocene ocean, including the warm water fish, early cetaceans, and diverse invertebrate lineages that had populated the coastal and offshore waters, were progressively replaced by cold-adapted fauna as temperatures declined. The giant penguins, whose large body size had been partly an adaptation to the thermal demands of diving in waters that were cool but not frigid, faced a changing ocean whose thermal regime was shifting toward conditions that favored different ecological strategies and different competitors. The geographic isolation that accompanied continental separation had evolutionary consequences independent of the climate change it drove. Populations of animals and plants that had previously been connected to the broader southern landmass fauna through gene flow and faunal exchange were progressively cut off as the seaways widened and deepened. Isolated populations evolve independently, accumulating genetic differences and, over sufficient time, diverging into distinct species. For the lineages that remained in Antarctica through the early phases of cooling and isolation, this meant that whatever evolutionary responses they mounted to the changing environment were constrained by the genetic variation available within the isolated population. Without the influx of new variants from connected populations elsewhere, adaptive options were limited to what already existed within the Antarctic gene pool. The drift of Antarctica into isolation was, in geological terms, one of the most consequential biogeographic events of the Cenozoic. It severed a southern landmass connection that had maintained biological continuity across the high southern latitudes for over 100 million years, initiated an oceanographic reorganization whose effects persist to the present day, and set the Antarctic continent on a climatic trajectory that would, within a few tens of millions of years, transform it from one of the most biologically diverse landmasses on Earth into the frozen, near-lifeless continent that exists today. The animals and plants that had built their lives in Antarctic ecosystems across the Mesozoic and early Paleogene had no mechanism for anticipating or responding to changes operating at this geographic and temporal scale. They could only respond to the immediate conditions they encountered, and those conditions, season by season and million year by million year, were becoming progressively less compatible with the ecosystems they had evolved to inhabit. The glaciation that reshaped Antarctica's interior did not arrive at the coastline simultaneously or uniformly. Ice sheets advance along gradients determined by elevation, bedrock topography, precipitation patterns, and proximity to the ocean, and the coastal margins of Antarctica, particularly along the Antarctic Peninsula and its associated island chains, retained conditions marginally compatible with biological persistence long after the continent's interior had been rendered uninhabitable. It was in these coastal refugia, narrow, topographically sheltered zones where ice-free ground persisted, where ocean influence moderated temperature extremes, and where biological productivity in the surrounding water continued to supply food resources, that the last representatives of Antarctica's ancient terrestrial and nearshore ecosystems made their final stand. The biological communities of these refugia were not the rich, diverse assemblages of the Eocene. They were reduced, simplified, and under continuous pressure from a climate moving steadily against them. But they persisted, and the fossil record of their persistence is itself scientifically significant. The vegetation of late Oligocene and early Miocene Antarctic refugia was dominated by cold-tolerant Nothofagus, the southern beech genus that had been a component of Antarctic forests since the Eocene and that proved more physiologically resilient to cooling than the conifers, tree ferns, and diverse angiosperms with which it had previously coexisted. Fossil wood and pollen assemblages from late Paleogene Antarctic peninsula sites document a vegetation transition from diverse multi-layered forest to low-diversity Nothofagus-dominated scrub and woodland, a biological simplification directly tracking the narrowing thermal envelope available to plant communities at these latitudes. Nothofagus species are capable of surviving mean annual temperatures approaching 0 degrees Celsius and can tolerate significant seasonal frost, making them among the last woody plants capable of persisting at high southern latitudes as conditions deteriorated. Their dominance in late Antarctic fossil floras is therefore not a coincidence, but a direct reflection of their position at the cold-tolerant extreme of the continent's surviving plant diversity. The animal communities dependent on these late refugial forests were correspondingly reduced. The diverse mammal fauna documented from the Eocene La Meseta Formation had no direct counterpart in the Oligocene and Miocene Antarctic record. The lineages that had occupied the middle and upper tiers of the Eocene terrestrial food web had either migrated northward or gone locally extinct as their habitat contracted. What persisted were likely the most cold-tolerant and ecologically flexible components of the fauna, small-bodied omnivores and insectivores capable of exploiting a wider range of food sources and surviving periods of reduced resource availability. The fossil record for this interval in Antarctica is sparse, partly because the environments that might have preserved it are now buried beneath ice or have been eroded by subsequent glacial activity, and partly because small-bodied animals in stressed, low-diversity ecosystems leave correspondingly thin fossil signatures. The giant penguins of the Antarctic coastline traced their own trajectory of decline through this interval. The diversity of large-bodied penguin species documented from the Eocene La Meseta Formation, Anthropornis, Paleoleptines, and their contemporaries does not persist into the Oligocene at comparable levels. The fossil record indicates a progressive reduction in giant penguin diversity through the late Eocene and into the Oligocene, with the largest body size classes disappearing first and smaller large penguin species persisting somewhat longer before they too vanished from the record. The causes of this decline were multiple and interacting. Ocean temperatures in the Southern Ocean were falling, altering the distribution and abundance of the fish and cephalopod prey on which giant penguins depended. The expanding diversity of pinnipeds, seals and sea lions introduced new competitors for fish prey and new predators capable of taking penguins at or near the surface. Toothed whales, diversifying rapidly through the Oligocene, similarly restructured the predator-prey dynamics of the Southern Ocean in ways that were disadvantageous to large, surface-dependent seabirds. The transition from giant penguins to the modern penguin fauna was not a replacement of one group by another in a single ecological moment. It was a gradual shift across millions of years, in which the average body size of the penguin lineage decreased, the diversity of large-bodied species contracted, and smaller-bodied species, more agile, less dependent on the thermal advantages of large mass in a progressively colder ocean, and capable of exploiting the krill and small fish that were becoming the dominant prey resource in cooling Southern Ocean waters, diversified to fill the ecological space being vacated by their larger relatives. By the early Miocene, the giant penguin lineages were gone, and the penguin fauna of the Southern Ocean had assumed a body size distribution broadly comparable to that seen in modern species, with the emperor penguin representing the large end of a range that no longer approached the dimensions of Anthropornis or Paleoleptines. The crocodilians that had occupied Antarctic rivers and wetlands during the Eocene had already disappeared from the continent well before the Miocene. Their exit from the Antarctic fossil record occurs in the late Eocene, consistent with the cooling of freshwater environments to temperatures below the threshold at which crocodilian metabolism can sustain activity and reproduction. Unlike the penguins, which could track changing ocean conditions by shifting foraging behavior and prey selection within the constraints of their physiology, crocodilians had no comparable flexibility in response to thermal change. Their ectothermic metabolism made them acutely sensitive to absolute temperature, and the cooling of Antarctic freshwater environments through the late Eocene left them no viable adaptive pathway other than range contraction northward, a retreat that the fossil record of South American Paleogene crocodilians is broadly consistent with, documenting the persistence of diverse crocodilian faunas on the warmer continent to the north, while the Antarctic record goes silent. The sub-Antarctic islands, South Georgia, the South Sandwich Islands, Heard Island, and the broader archipelago of islands scattered across the Southern Ocean between Antarctica and the southern tips of the inhabited continents, served as biological relay stations during the period of Antarctic deterioration. Species capable of island hopping could track suitable habitat northward across these stepping stones as conditions on the continent itself became untenable, maintaining populations in environments that preserved something of the ecological character of the earlier Antarctic coastal zone. The vegetation of some sub-Antarctic islands today, dominated by tussock grasses, ferns, and in a few cases, small Nothofagus stands, may represent the attenuated descendants of the plant communities that retreated northward from Antarctica as glaciation advanced, preserved on islands where the moderating influence of the surrounding ocean has maintained conditions just warm enough for their persistence. By the late Miocene, the biological communities of Antarctica had been reduced to what the modern continent displays in its coastal and marine zones. Breeding colonies of modern penguin species, populations of seals hauling out on ice-free rocky shores, and the extraordinarily productive but physically harsh marine ecosystem of the Southern Ocean. The terrestrial biological richness that had characterized the continent from the Cretaceous through the Eocene had been entirely erased from the interior and from all but the most marginal coastal positions. What had been one of the most ecologically diverse landmasses on Earth, home to dinosaurs, tropical and temperate forests, giant birds, crocodilians, and diverse mammal faunas across more than 100 million years of continuous biological occupation, had become, within the span of roughly 30 million years of progressive cooling, the most biologically impoverished continent on the planet. The ice that accomplished this transformation did so not through violence, but through persistence, accumulating degree by degree and layer by layer until the world beneath it had been entirely and, for all practical purposes, permanently erased. The ice that erased Antarctica's living world did not destroy its record entirely. Beneath the sheet that now averages 2.1 kilometers in thickness across the continent's interior, reaching a maximum of approximately 4.9 kilometers in the deepest bedrock depressions of East Antarctica, the physical evidence of everything that lived and grew and moved across this landmass over more than 100 million years remains compressed, frozen, and in many cases extraordinarily well preserved by the same cold that ended the ecosystems it entombs. The paradox of Antarctic paleontology is that the agent of biological destruction is simultaneously the agent of biological preservation. The ice that killed the forests sealed them, and the permafrost that followed the retreating tree line arrested the decay of organic material that warmer conditions would have eliminated entirely. What lies beneath Antarctica's ice is not simply rock. It is a biological archive of exceptional completeness relative to the difficulty of accessing it, and the science of reading that archive has accelerated significantly in the past 3 decades. The most direct evidence of Antarctica's buried biological past comes from the continent's exposed geological margins, the ice-free coastal zones, nunataks, and mountain ranges where bedrock and sedimentary sequences reach the surface and are accessible to direct field sampling. The Transantarctic Mountains, extending approximately 3,500 kilometers across the continent, from the Ross Sea to the Weddell Sea, expose Cretaceous and Paleogene sedimentary sequences at elevations and positions where glacial erosion has removed the overlying ice and revealed the rock beneath. From these exposures, paleontologists have recovered fossil wood, leaf impressions, pollen assemblages, invertebrate remains, and vertebrate material spanning the interval from the Triassic through the Eocene, a stratigraphic range that documents the full arc of Antarctica's biological history from its early Mesozoic forests through the peak of its Paleogene diversity. The logistical challenges of working in these environments are considerable. Field seasons are short, weather is unpredictable, and the remoteness of most productive fossil sites requires significant infrastructure to access. But the scientific return on Antarctic fieldwork has consistently exceeded expectations as new sites are identified and existing ones more thoroughly sampled. Seymour Island, off the northern tip of the Antarctic Peninsula, remains the single most productive paleontological site on the continent and one of the most important Eocene fossil localities in the southern hemisphere. The La Meseta Formation, exposed on Seymour Island, preserves a near-coastal Eocene environment in exceptional stratigraphic detail, with fossil-bearing horizons distributed through a sedimentary sequence more than 700 meters thick. The diversity of material recovered from this single site: giant penguins, early whales, sharks, bony fish, marsupials, early ungulates, invertebrates, and plant remains, provides a cross-sectional view of an entire Eocene coastal ecosystem that would be remarkable from any location on Earth, and is extraordinary given its Antarctic provenance. Ongoing excavation of the La Meseta Formation continues to yield new species and new ecological information, and the site's potential is considered far from exhausted by researchers currently working there. Beyond the exposed geological margins, the ice sheet itself contains biological information of a different but complementary kind. Ice cores drilled from the Antarctic ice sheet record atmospheric and climatic conditions extending back approximately 800,000 years in the deepest cores currently recovered, a time frame that encompasses multiple glacial-interglacial cycles and provides detailed records of temperature, atmospheric composition, dust loading, and biological productivity in the surrounding ocean. Trapped air bubbles in ice cores preserve samples of ancient atmospheres, allowing direct measurement of greenhouse gas concentrations at specific points in the past. Biological material, pollen grains, fungal spores, microbial cells, and fragments of organic matter is also preserved within the ice, providing information about vegetation and ecosystem conditions during the intervals represented by each layer. Projects currently underway aim to recover ice cores extending back 1.5 million years or more, potentially reaching climatic intervals not represented in any existing core record. Beneath the ice sheet itself, a hydrological world of unexpected complexity has been mapped through geophysical survey techniques developed and refined over the past 4 decades. Radio echo sounding, a method that transmits radar pulses downward through the ice and records reflections from the ice bedrock interface and from water bodies within and beneath the ice, has revealed the existence of more than 400 subglacial lakes distributed across the Antarctic continent. The largest of these, Lake Vostok, underlies approximately 250 kilometers of ice in East Antarctica and covers an area of roughly 15,000 square kilometers, comparable in surface area to Lake Ontario. Lake Vostok has been isolated from the surface environment for an estimated 15 to 25 million years, sealed beneath ice that accumulated after the Middle Miocene climate transition cut off the region's last connections to surface ecosystems. Water samples recovered from the ice immediately above the lake's surface, refrozen lake water accreted to the base of the overlying ice sheet, have yielded evidence of microbial life, indicating that biological activity persists in this dark, cold, high-pressure environment despite its extreme isolation. The biological significance of Antarctica's subglacial lakes extends beyond their role as potential refugia for microbial life. These water bodies exist at the interface between the overlying ice and the underlying bedrock, maintained in liquid state by geothermal heat from the Earth's interior and by the insulating effect of the ice above. Their sediments, accumulating continuously since the lakes were sealed beneath the ice, may preserve biological and chemical records of environmental conditions extending back millions of years, records that could document the transition from ice-free to glaciated conditions in specific regions of the continent with a resolution unavailable from any other Antarctic archive. Accessing these sediments without contaminating them, introducing surface microorganisms into an environment that may have been isolated for tens of millions of years, represents one of the most technically demanding challenges in contemporary polar science, and international protocols for subglacial lake access have been developed specifically to address this concern. The topography concealed beneath Antarctica's ice sheet has itself been revealed in increasing detail by airborne and satellite-based geophysical surveys, particularly the comprehensive datasets assembled through projects including BedMap and its successors. These surveys have mapped the bedrock surface of the entire Antarctic continent at resolutions sufficient to identify major landscape features, mountain ranges, river valleys, basins, and plains that are completely invisible from the surface. The results have been consistently surprising in their complexity. Beneath the West Antarctic ice sheet, the bedrock topography includes deep basins lying more than 2,500 meters below sea level. Terrain that, if the ice were removed, would be open ocean rather than land. Beneath East Antarctica, the Gamburtsev subglacial mountains rise to elevations exceeding 3,400 meters above sea level, forming a mountain range comparable in scale to the European Alps that has been entirely hidden beneath ice for tens of millions of years and was unknown to science until geophysical surveys revealed its existence in the 1950s. These buried landscapes are not merely geological curiosities. They are the physical surface on which Antarctica's ancient ecosystems existed. The valleys through which Eocene rivers flowed, the basins in which Cretaceous lakes accumulated sediment, the plains across which dinosaurs moved and forests grew. The correspondence between the subglacial topography now being mapped and the depositional environments that produced the fossil record is direct and interpretively significant. River systems identified in the subglacial topography of the Antarctic Peninsula region align with sedimentary sequences that record fluvial deposition during the Eocene, allowing researchers to reconstruct the hydrological networks of the ancient landscape with a spatial specificity that surface geology alone could not provide. The integration of geophysical landscape mapping with paleontological and sedimentological data represents one of the most productive current directions in Antarctic earth science, producing reconstructions of ancient Antarctic environments with a level of geographic and ecological detail that would have been impossible to achieve even 2 decades ago. The pace of discovery in Antarctic paleontology and geophysics has accelerated in recent years, as technological capabilities have expanded and international research programs have increased the frequency and geographic range of Antarctic fieldwork. New fossil sites are identified during nearly every field season. New species are described from material collected at established sites, and geophysical surveys continue to reveal landscape features and subglacial water bodies that add complexity to the picture of what lies beneath the ice. The continent that appears, from its surface, to be among the simplest and most uniform environments on Earth is revealed, through these methods, to be one of the most complex and information-rich geological archives available to science. A frozen record of more than 100 million years of biological and environmental history, still being read, still yielding surprises, and still far from fully understood. Everything documented across the preceding chapters, the giant penguins on Eocene beaches, the forests behind them, the dinosaurs that had moved through an older version of those same latitudes, the crocodilians in the rivers, the mammals in the understory, the marine predators offshore, and the slow glacial erasure of all of it, converges on a single conclusion that the science now supports with considerable confidence. It was, across a span of more than 100 million years, one of the most biologically dynamic and ecologically complex regions on the planet, and the transformation that converted it into what it is today was not a geological inevitability written into its position on the globe, but the contingent outcome of a specific sequence of tectonic, oceanographic, and atmospheric changes that could, under marginally different boundary conditions, have unfolded differently. The reconstruction of Antarctica's vanished ecosystems is not a speculative exercise. It is a scientific program grounded in physical evidence. Fossil bone, fossil wood, fossil pollen, isotopic ratios in ancient shells, radar reflections from buried landscapes, chemical signatures in ice cores, and the picture it produces, though still incomplete in many of its details, is coherent, internally consistent, and supported by multiple independent lines of inquiry. The Cretaceous forests of Antarctica are not inferred from a single ambiguous specimen. They are documented by fossil wood samples, showing growth ring patterns consistent with polar photoperiodic conditions, by pollen assemblages identifying the specific plant taxa present, and by isotopic data from paleosol horizons confirming the temperature and moisture regimes under which those plants grew. The giant penguins are not reconstructed from fragmentary material subject to multiple interpretations. Their skeletal remains are sufficiently complete to support rigorous biomechanical analysis, and the size estimates derived from those remains have been independently confirmed by multiple research groups using different scaling methodologies. What makes Antarctica's biological history scientifically significant extends beyond the intrinsic interest of its individual components. The continent functions as a natural experiment of exceptional clarity, a landmass that experienced, in geological sequence, nearly every major type of environmental transformation that Earth's climate system is capable of producing, and that preserved the biological record of those transformations in sedimentary archives that are, in many localities, exceptionally undisturbed. The transition from greenhouse to icehouse conditions recorded in Antarctic sedimentary sequences is the most complete and best resolved record of that type of climatic shift available anywhere on Earth. The biological responses to that transition, the contraction of forest biomes, the extinction of thermophilic fauna, the restructuring of marine food webs, are documented in sufficient detail to allow quantitative analysis of the rates and mechanisms of ecological change under sustained climatic forcing. The relevance of this record to contemporary climate science is direct and increasingly recognized within the research community. Earth's current trajectory of atmospheric greenhouse gas increase is moving the climate system in the direction opposite to the one that froze Antarctica, toward higher temperatures, reduced ice cover, and oceanographic conditions more similar to those of the Eocene than to those of the Pleistocene. The Antarctic paleoclimate record provides empirical constraints on how the Earth system responds to greenhouse forcing at the high end of the range currently being approached. Eocene atmospheric carbon dioxide concentrations, estimated at between 1,000 and 2,000 parts per million, bracket the upper range of projections for the late 21st and 22nd centuries under high-emission scenarios. The Antarctic environments that existed under those concentrations, ice-free coastlines, temperate forests at polar latitudes, sea surface temperatures 8 to 12 degrees Celsius above modern values, are not theoretical constructs. They are documented realities, preserved in rock and ice, and they describe what a high CO2 Earth actually looked like, rather than what models project it might look like. The ice sheet itself, whose growth erased Antarctica's ancient ecosystems, is now the central object of concern in projections of future sea level change. The West Antarctic ice sheet, grounded largely on bedrock below sea level, is considered by glaciologists to be potentially unstable under sustained warming, vulnerable to a marine ice sheet instability mechanism in which ocean warming at the grounding line drives retreat that, once initiated, may be difficult or impossible to halt through any reduction in surface forcing. The volume of ice in the West Antarctic ice sheet, if transferred to the ocean, would raise global sea levels by approximately 3.3 meters. The East Antarctic ice sheet, larger and grounded on bedrock above sea level across much of its extent, is considered more stable but not immune to forcing at the margins. Understanding the conditions under which these ice sheets grew, how they responded to past warm intervals, and what thresholds govern their stability, requires exactly the kind of deep paleoclimate record that Antarctica's geological archive provides. The sub-Antarctic islands and the Southern Ocean that surrounds them are already registering measurable responses to contemporary warming. Sea surface temperatures in parts of the Southern Ocean have increased by approximately 0.2 degrees Celsius per decade over the past 50 years, a rate small in absolute terms, but large relative to the thermal sensitivities of the cold-adapted ecosystems currently inhabiting those waters. Krill populations, the foundation of the modern Southern Ocean food web, show distributional shifts consistent with changing sea ice extent and ocean temperature. Penguin breeding colonies on sub-Antarctic islands are experiencing altered timing of sea ice formation that affects prey availability during critical reproductive periods. These are early signals of a system beginning to move, not yet at the pace of the Eocene-Oligocene transition, but in a direction whose long-term trajectory the paleoclimate record illuminates with uncomfortable clarity. The fossils emerging from Antarctica's melting coastal margins, specimens exposed by glacial retreat and permafrost thaw along the Antarctic Peninsula, where warming has been most rapid, add a particular resonance to the scientific work being conducted there. Paleontologists working on the peninsula are, in a literal sense, racing against the same process they are studying, recovering fossil material from exposures that are themselves the product of contemporary ice loss, before that material is destroyed by the erosion that its exposure initiates. The giant penguin bones, the fossil wood, the ancient pollen preserved in sediment cores, these are being extracted from a landscape that is itself undergoing transformation, and the scientists recovering them are simultaneously documenting a world that ice destroyed in the past and observing the early stages of a world that warming may transform in the future. Antarctica's lost world, its forests, its dinosaurs, its crocodilians, its giant birds, its warm coastal seas, is not simply a curiosity of deep time. It is a documented state of the Earth system, achieved under boundary conditions that the current trajectory of atmospheric change is moving toward, and preserved in physical evidence of sufficient quality and completeness to inform both scientific understanding and the broader human reckoning with what planetary-scale environmental change actually produces. The ice that covers it is melting at its margins. The record beneath it is being read with increasing resolution and increasing urgency, and the world it describes, warm, biologically rich, and utterly unlike the frozen continent visible today, stands as the most precise available answer to the question of what this part of the Earth looks like when the conditions that maintain its ice are no longer in place.